Is cluster bomb helping Ukraine change the situation? Finally, the U.S. has decided to provide Ukraine with cluster bombs, which are banned in the majority of countries worldwide. It is known that U.S. lawmakers have prevented President Joe Biden from taking such a step. Even the human rights organization Human Rights Watch, HRW, has condemned this intention, stating, "The transfer of these weapons will undoubtedly lead to long-lasting suffering for civilians and disable international criticism of their use." 1. Why did the U.S. decide to do this? All military experts agree that such a decision was made because the U.S. wants to compensate for Ukraine's serious failures in countering Russia's offensive. The casualties suffered by Ukraine in terms of human resources, as well as military equipment, are significant and the results have been disastrous. Laura Cooper, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, does not hide this fact. This is due to the need to break through the Russian military's defense system. 1. What are cluster bombs? How do they work? Cluster bombs are not ground-to-ground, or ground-to-ground, weapons. They can be special rockets, bombs, or projectiles containing a large number of submunitions, individual explosive devices. Simply put, they are containers that open in the air over a designated area to destroy and disperse a large number of explosive devices. In simple terms, cluster bombs are weapons capable of blanketing and attacking a very large area at once. Such bombs and munitions leave nothing alive under their destructive power. The area of destruction caused by cluster bombs is about 5 times larger than conventional weapons. What is particularly considered inhumane is that part of these bombs does not explode immediately and remains buried in the ground for many years. As a result, civilians will suffer long-term consequences. 1. What type of cluster bomb did Kiev request from Washington? Ukraine requested the Mk-20 Rockeye-2 cluster bombs from the U.S. These bombs weigh 222 kg and each bomb carries 247 submunitions with armor-piercing heads that can penetrate approximately 190 mm. When one of these bombs is dropped, its affected area is roughly equivalent to the size of a football field, 100 by 70 meters. Leaked information suggests that Ukraine is planning to deploy these bombs from unmanned aerial vehicles. In this case, calculations have been made as the core of the Mk-20 has greater armor-piercing capabilities compared to the bombs currently dropped by combat drones. 1. How does the U.S. decision to provide cluster bombs to Ukraine relate to the International Treaty on the Use of these weapons? The Convention on Cluster Munitions is an international treaty that strictly prohibits the use, transportation, and stockpiling of such bombs and munitions. The convention was signed in 2008, came into force in 2010, and to date, 113 countries have signed it. They commit to never use cluster bombs under any circumstances. Not to use cluster bombs. Not to develop, produce, acquire, stockpile, retain, or transfer cluster bombs to anyone. Not to assist, encourage, or induce anyone to use these inhumane weapons. 34 countries have not signed the convention, including the U.S., Israel, Ukraine, and Russia. 1. Can Ukraine change the situation on the battlefield with cluster bombs? Kiev's hope in this regard may turn out to be an illusion, similar to the blind faith in the power of other Western weapons. Cluster bombs are a serious and particularly cruel and cunning element on the battlefield. However, it is evident that the Russian military will not sit idly by in trenches waiting for Ukrainian forces to drop cluster bombs on them. Storage facilities for cluster bombs will also be targeted with the same type of ammunition. Similarly, aircraft or drones carrying cluster bombs will be the targets of Russian air defense forces. Russia's electronic warfare, EU, systems will neutralize them. In the end, if the US and Ukraine take such a step, nothing can prevent Russia from retaliating with similar bombs and artillery shells. US allies plan to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. Both Canada and the UK have expressed strong opposition to the proposal of sending cluster bombs to Ukraine, highlighting their concerns about the use of such weapons in the conflict. These Western nations have reaffirmed their commitment to a UN agreement that prohibits the use of cluster munitions and have emphasized the need to avoid employing them in the ongoing conflict with Russia. In a statement to the national broadcaster CTV, the Canadian government clearly stated its position, saying, "We do not support the use of cluster munitions." Ottawa remains dedicated to ending the adverse effects that cluster munitions have on civilians, particularly children. Similarly, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak emphasized that the UK does not endorse the use of cluster bombs. He explained, "The UK is a signatory to a convention that prohibits production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use." Sunak further stated that London would continue to support Ukraine through alternative means. Canada confirmed its compliance with the UN Convention that bans cluster munitions, which was adopted in 2008. Over 110 nations have joined this agreement since its inception. Cluster bombs consist of smaller explosive submunitions that are dispersed over a target area during flight and are typically used against personnel and lightly armored vehicles. These weapons can also leave behind undetonated remnants that pose risks in former conflict zones for years. Earl Turcotte, a veteran Canadian diplomat and disarmament activist, stressed the urgency of opposing the U.S. decision. He stated, "People continue to die because of the use of this type of weapon." Turcotte, who led the Canadian delegation during the talks on the 2008 convention, urged Ottawa to explicitly condemn the U.S. decision. However, Washington expressed a different viewpoint. When asked about potential harm to the civilian population caused by the U.S.-made bombs in Ukraine, a senior Pentagon official claimed that, "The worst thing for civilians in Ukraine is for Russia to win." The announcement of the U.S. plan has raised concerns among several nations, including some U.S. allies and the United Nations. Germany, for instance, reiterated its commitment to the UN treaty banning cluster munitions, while Austria warned against sending such ordnance to a conflict zone, stating that it would send the wrong message. Spain firmly emphasized that Ukraine should not use cluster munitions, under any circumstances. Moscow condemned Washington's decision, describing it as an act of desperation that would not impact its ongoing military campaign but would have grave consequences for non-combatants. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova declared that the U.S. would bear full responsibility for the deaths of both Russian and Ukrainian children.